The silence was the loudest thing in the house. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket where the rhythmic wheeze of an oxygen machine and her husband's labored breaths used to be. Elena, at 45, felt 100. A cold, damp chill seeped up from the bare floorboards, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat of the Texas summer pressing in from outside. Her hands, the hands of a seamstress that once danced over silk and lace, were raw and chapped from scrubbing floors and packing boxes. She felt a familiar knot of grief tighten in her chest, a physical ache that never truly subsided. The house, once filled with the scent of his aftershave and the sound of his laughter, now smelled only of dust, cardboard, and decay. It was no longer a home. It was a tomb of memories she was about to be evicted from. Every shadow seemed to mock her, every empty doorway a reminder of the life that had been stolen, piece by painful piece. On the scratched kitchen counter, next to a wilting plant he had given her, lay 2 documents. One was the foreclosure notice, its bold red letters a screaming indictment of their tragedy. Final notice. The other was a thin stack of worn bills held together by a paperclip. She counted it again. A ritual of self-torture she'd performed a dozen times that morning. $700. Not 701 still, not 699. Exactly $700 was all that remained after a lifetime of shared dreams and a year of catastrophic medical debt. She could feel the texture of each bill, thin, soft, smelling faintly of 1,000 other hands, 1,000 other desperate transactions. This paltry sum was the final insult, the scrap left over after the hospital, the pharmacy, and the bank had picked the bones of their life clean. Her stomach twisted with a hunger she ignored. Food was a luxury they couldn't afford if they wanted to survive the week. In the corner of the living room, her 10-year-old son, Leo, sat surrounded by sealed boxes, his small shoulders hunched over a drawing pad. He was trying so hard to be brave, to be the little man of the house, but she could see the fear shimmering in his wide, dark eyes, his father's eyes. A tear slid silently down Elena's cheek, hot against her cold skin. He was just a child. He should be worried about scraped knees and homework, not whether they would have a roof over their heads. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on her lungs, making each breath a conscious effort. She felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. How could she have failed him so completely? She was his mother, his protector, and she was leading him into homelessness. The world outside felt sharp and hostile, a place with no room for a grieving widow and her boy. 3 days. The words from the bank manager's call echoed in her mind, short and brutal like a gunshot. 3 days until the locks would be changed. 3 days until they were officially nothing. Just 2 more ghosts haunting the city streets. She could hear the distant sounds of life carrying on without them, the rumble of a passing truck, the faint laughter of neighborhood children playing in the afternoon sun. It felt like a personal cruelty, this vibrant, indifferent world that continued to spin while hers had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Her gaze fell upon her old sewing machine, packed away in its case. It was a Singer, a heavy, black, beautiful machine her own mother had used. It was her trade, her art, her one skill. But her hands had forgotten their craft, frozen by grief and the relentless anxiety that now governed her every waking moment. The fear was a living thing inside her now. It was a cold, coiling serpent in her gut, its venom seeping into her blood, paralyzing her will. She closed her eyes, and the darkness offered no relief, only the vivid memory of her husband's face in his final hours, the promise she had made to him to keep Leo safe, a promise she was breaking. A dry sob escaped her lips, a harsh, ragged sound in the suffocating quiet. $700 and a 10-year-old son who trusted her. It wasn't a starting point. It was an ending. She was standing at the edge of a precipice, the solid ground of her past gone forever, and below her was nothing but a black, terrifying abyss. There was no hope here. There was only the fall. That night, sleep was a distant country she couldn't reach. In the blue, sterile glow of her phone screen, Elena's thumb scrolled relentlessly, a desperate, repetitive motion. The digital world was a blur of unattainable salvation. Clean apartments with rents that were a cruel joke, shared rooms that forbade children, job listings that required skills and energy she no longer possessed. Each swipe was a small death, another door slamming shut in her face. She felt the cold panic begin to crawl up her spine again, a familiar icy tendril. She could hear Leo's soft, even breathing from the floor beside her, where he slept on a pallet of blankets. The sound, which once brought her comfort, was now a ticking clock counting down the seconds to their ruin. Her fingers trembled as she typed in a new search, a wild, hopeless query for properties under $1,000. It was the digital equivalent of sifting through a dumpster, and she felt the shame of it burn hot in her chest, a fresh layer of humiliation on an already raw wound. It appeared like a ghost on the screen. Her singled a grainy photograph of a windmill, its dark shape stark against a washed-out sky. The listing was short, devoid of cheerful realtor jargon. Remote windmill with attached miller's house, sold for land value only, as is. The price made her heart stop. It was a pittance, a number so low it had to be a mistake. It would take almost every cent she had, leaving them with nothing but loose change for gas and food. A wave of dizziness washed over her. This wasn't a choice. It was a gamble born of pure, undiluted desperation. The words land value only screamed of ruin and decay, but the word land whispered of ownership, a patch of earth they couldn't be thrown off of. Her mind raced, picturing a rickety but solid roof, a place to put her sewing machine, a sanctuary. She stared at the photo, trying to will it into being more than it was, projecting a fragile fantasy of safety onto the blurry image. She knew it was madness, but the alternative, Leo's face looking up at her on a cold street corner, was unthinkable. With a hand that shook so badly she could barely hold the phone, she made the call. A brusque, indifferent voice on the other end confirmed the price and the condition. "It's a teardown, lady. You're buying the dirt it's on." The man's tone was dismissive, but it didn't matter. Elena's voice was a strained whisper as she agreed, her heart pounding a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. The digital transaction was cold and instantaneous. She watched the balance in her account drain away, the numbers shrinking until only a pathetic two-digit figure remained. A profound finality settled over her. She had just thrown their last lifeline into the dark, aiming for an unseen shore. The fear didn't leave. It simply changed shape. The terror of the street was replaced by the terror of the unknown. She felt an overwhelming urge to be sick, the acid of regret and anxiety rising in her throat. She had just bought them a tombstone instead of a home. There was no going back now. The die was cast. The fall had begun. The journey was an odyssey of despair. Their old car, groaning under the weight of their condensed life, felt like a hearse carrying them away from everything they had ever known. The city's familiar skyline receded in the rearview mirror until it was just a smudge of grey, replaced by the endless, monotonous expanse of the highway. Leo was quiet in the passenger seat, his face pressed against the glass, watching the world blur by. The silence in the car was thick with unspoken fears. Eleanor gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, her entire body thrumming with a high-strung tension. The sun beat down relentlessly, baking the asphalt and filling the car with the smell of hot plastic and impending doom. She drove for hours, fueled by stale coffee and a gnawing emptiness in her stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. Every mile marker they passed felt like another nail being hammered into the coffin of her hopes. She was driving them into exile, and the loneliness of the open road was a crushing weight on her soul. As they veered off the main highway, the world began to shrink and decay around them. The smooth asphalt gave way to a cracked and pitted county road, which in turn devolved into a gravel track that rattled the car's aging frame, making Elena's teeth ache. The landscape grew wilder, more desolate. The vibrant greens of civilization faded to dusty browns and muted olives. There were no other cars, no signs of life, just the lonely cry of a hawk circling high overhead and the sound of gravel crunching under their tires. A sense of profound isolation began to creep into the car, a chilling presence that was more terrifying than the city's hostile crowds. She felt her breath catch in her throat. This wasn't rural. This was forgotten. This was a place where people disappeared. Her hands grew slick with sweat on the wheel. Leo stirred beside her, his voice small. "Ma, are we almost there?" he asked. Elena forced a smile that felt like cracking plaster. "Almost way, sweetheart," she lied, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. Finally, they saw it. Cresting a small, dusty hill, the windmill rose against the bruised twilight sky. It was not a rustic monument. It was a skeleton, a jagged, rotting carcass of a building, its four great arms splintered and broken, hanging at grotesque angles like the limbs of a giant corpse. One was missing entirely. The structure listed heavily to one side, a dark, menacing silhouette that seemed to suck the remaining light from the evening. A cold dread, sharp and absolute, pierced through Elena's carefully constructed wall of denial. This was worse than she had imagined, so much worse. The grainy photo had been a cruel liar, a master of hiding the full extent of the rot. She pulled the car to a stop, the engine sputtering into a sudden, shocking silence. The only sound was the wind, a low, mournful moan as it whistled through the windmill's broken bones. It sounded like a creature in pain. Her hope, which had been so fragile to begin with, shattered completely, leaving nothing but the icy certainty that she had made a catastrophic mistake. The miller's house, attached to the base of the windmill like a cancerous growth, was even more derelict. The roof sagged in the middle, a deep, sorrowful curve that promised imminent collapse. Most of the windows were not just shattered, but entirely gone, leaving gaping black mouths that stared out at the barren landscape. The front door hung from a single, rusted hinge. As Elena pushed it open, a wave of foul air rolled out, hitting her with physical force. It was a sickening, complex stench, the damp, earthy smell of rot and black mold, the sharp, acrid odor of rat droppings, and a cloyingly sweet undertone of something long dead. She felt the nausea from the drive return with a vengeance, and she gagged, covering her mouth with her hand. Her heart, which had been pounding with anxiety, now seemed to shrink in her chest, a tight, painful knot of pure despair. This wasn't a house. It was a grave, a place that had been left to die, and now she had dragged her son here to die with it. A single, hot tear of rage and self-loathing escaped her eye. Stepping inside was like entering another world, a forgotten pocket of time where decay was king. The floorboards, slick with a fine layer of grime and dampness, squelched and groaned under her weight. In the gloom, she could see furniture, or what was left of it, shrouded in thick cobwebs and dust, their shapes ghostly and distorted. A rat skittered across the floor, a flicker of greasy brown, and disappeared into a hole in the wall. Leo let out a small gasp and pressed himself against her leg, his small hand gripping her jeans tightly. Elena automatically put a protective arm around him, but she felt like a fraud. What protection could she offer here? She was the one who had led them into the monster's maw. The air was heavy and still, so thick with the smell of neglect it felt hard to breathe. The silence was absolute, broken only by the drip of water from the ruined ceiling into a puddle on the floor. Each drop sounded like a hammer blow against her sanity, a steady, relentless reminder of her failure. She had to do something, anything, to fight the paralysis that was creeping over her. Action was the only antidote to the suffocating despair. "We just need to clean," she said, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. It was a lie, a desperate mantra against the overwhelming evidence of ruin. She found a pile of damp rags in a rotted cupboard and began to attack the nearest surface, a large, grime-caked mirror hanging precariously on the main room's wall. Her hands worked mechanically, scrubbing at the layers of filth. The work was disgusting. The grime came away in thick, black streaks, smelling of mildew and age, but the physical effort was a small release, a way to channel the frantic, screaming energy that was building inside her. For Leo's sake, she had to pretend this was manageable. She had to pretend this was a home. She scrubbed harder, her knuckles raw, trying to wipe away not just the dirt, but the crushing reality of their situation, trying to find a clear space in the filth where she could see a glimmer of a future. As she cleared a patch of the mirror, her own reflection began to emerge from the cloudy depths. She looked like a stranger. Her face was gaunt, her eyes wide and haunted, framed by greasy, unwashed hair. She saw the deep lines of exhaustion and grief etched around her mouth and eyes. It was the face of a defeated woman. She stared at this ghost of herself, a cold knot of sorrow tightening in her chest. This was what it had come to. This hollowed-out shell was all that was left of the woman who once designed wedding dresses, who laughed with her husband, who believed in a safe and happy future. The reflection seemed to mock her, a silent testament to her complete and utter ruin. The house wasn't just a physical prison, It was a mirror to her soul, reflecting back all her own decay and brokenness. A profound wave of hopelessness washed over her, so powerful it made her knees feel weak. She had nothing left. No money, no home, no hope, not even a memory of the person she used to be. And then she saw it, in the grimy, wavering glass of the mirror. For just a fraction of a second, a shape materialized in the room behind her reflection. It was tall and dark, a solid, masculine silhouette standing in the doorway that led to the back of the house. Her blood ran cold. A primal fear, sharp and electric, shot through her entire body. It was not a trick of the light. It was there. She saw the distinct shape of a head and broad shoulders. A scream caught in her throat, strangled into a choked gasp. She spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The doorway was empty. There was nothing there but deepening shadows and the peeling, water-stained wallpaper. The silence of the room rushed back in, heavier and more menacing than before. Her breath came in short, ragged bursts, and a cold sweat broke out across her forehead. The air suddenly felt 10 degrees colder, charged with a malevolent energy. She stood frozen, listening. Her senses were screaming, every nerve ending on high alert. She listened for a creaking floorboard, a muffled breath, any sign that she was not alone. But there was nothing. Only the mournful cry of the wind outside and the steady, maddening drip of water from the ceiling. Was she losing her mind? Was the stress and grief finally making her hallucinate? She wanted to believe that, to dismiss it as a product of her frayed nerves, but the image had been too clear, too solid. The feeling of being watched was too real. A shiver, deep and violent, racked her body. She slowly backed away from the mirror, her eyes darting into every dark corner of the squalid room. The fear she felt now was different from the fear of poverty. This was an ancient reptilian fear, the fear of the dark, of the unknown, of a presence that should not be there. The despair that had been her constant companion now mingled with a new, terrifying emotion, dread. Leo, sensing the sudden shift in her, tightened his grip on her leg. "Mommy, what's wrong?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Elena couldn't answer. She couldn't tear her gaze from the empty doorway where the shadow had been. The man's silhouette was burned into her mind, tall, imposing. It felt like a warning, it felt like a claim. This place, this ruin she had bought with the last of their money, was not empty. It was not just abandoned. It was haunted. The realization settled in her gut, like a block of ice. She had not brought her son to a shelter. She had brought him into a trap. The isolation that had seemed so daunting before now felt lethal. They were miles from anyone, alone in a decaying house with, what? A ghost, a memory, a threat. The last ember of hope she had clung to was finally extinguished, replaced by a suffocating, absolute darkness. She gathered Leo into her arms. Holding him so tightly he grunted in protest. She buried her face in his hair, inhaling the familiar, comforting scent of her child, a stark contrast to the smell of rot that permeated the air. Her body was trembling uncontrollably. She had hit the bottom. She had thought the foreclosure was the worst it could get, but she had been wrong. This was the bottom, a derelict, isolated ruin with no money, no neighbors, and a terrifying, unseen presence that watched them from the shadows. The house was no longer just a symbol of her failure. It was an active threat. A cold, palpable sense of doom filled the room, and Elena felt its icy fingers wrap around her heart. She was trapped, utterly and completely trapped in the deepest, darkest hole she could have ever imagined, and she had dragged her son down with her. The silence of the house pressed in, no longer empty, but waiting. As darkness finally consumed the last of the daylight, painting the gaping windows in shades of black and deep indigo, Elena didn't dare to light a lamp. She and Leo huddled together under a single thin blanket on the filthy floor, as far from the mirror and the back doorway as possible. Every creak of the old house, every gust of wind that rattled the broken panes, sent a fresh jolt of terror through her. She was wide awake, her eyes straining in the dark, listening. The despair was a physical weight, a suffocating presence that was almost as real as the shadow she had seen. It filled her lungs, making each breath a struggle. She felt a crushing sense of finality, as if she were a character in a tragedy who had just walked on stage for the final brutal act. The hope she had chased across the state was not just false, it was a cruel, elaborate trap, and as she lay there in the cold and the dark, listening to the house groan around them, she knew with a chilling certainty that the worst was yet to come. The days that followed were a grueling test of endurance, a monotonous cycle of filth and futility. Elena worked from a hollowed-out place within herself, driven by a desperate, animal instinct to create a safe space for her son. The memory of the shadow in the mirror was a constant, cold presence at the back of her mind, a quiet hum of dread beneath the surface of her exhaustion. She scrubbed floors that seemed to exhale dust, patched broken window panes with cardboard that did little to keep out the mournful, whistling wind, and fought a losing battle against the pervasive stench of decay. The windmill itself loomed over them, a silent, skeletal judge watching her pathetic efforts. She felt her hope, which had been so brutally murdered upon arrival, being buried deeper with every bucket of grimy water she emptied onto the parched, dead earth outside. The silence of the place was no longer just empty. It felt watchful, charged with a history that seemed to resist her presence at every turn. Leo, a ghost in their new, ruined world, tried to be small, to be quiet, to not add to her burdens. He had seen the terror in her eyes the day they arrived, the way her shoulders had slumped in utter defeat, and some deep, childish instinct told him to retreat. He spent his time in the large main room, the only space Elena had managed to clear of the worst debris, his imagination a solitary refuge against the oppressive reality. He drew pictures of their old house, with its green lawn and smiling sun, a stark painful contrast to the grey desolation outside his door. He had a single small toy car, its red paint chipped and faded, and he would roll it back and forth across the uneven floorboards, the tiny plastic wheels making a whirring sound that was swallowed by the house's immense quiet. He was tracing the patterns in the wood, the knots and lines that looked like faces and maps, when his car passed over one particular spot and made a different sound, a sound he had not heard before. It was a dull, hollow thud, not a creak. "Mom," he said, his voice tentative, barely a whisper. Elena, on her hands and knees scrubbing a stubborn stain near the hearth, looked up, her body aching with a weariness that felt bone deep. She felt a flash of irritation, her nerves stretched to their breaking point. She didn't have the energy for childish games or imagined noises. "What is it, Leo?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. She immediately felt a pang of guilt. "It made a funny noise," he explained, pointing with a small, dirt-smudged finger. "Right here." To demonstrate, he pushed his little car over the spot again. Thump. It was unmistakable. A low, resonant sound like tapping on a drum, entirely different from the high-pitched groans and creaks of the surrounding wood. Elena's heart gave a sudden, painful lurch. Her gaze shot from the floorboard to the grimy mirror still hanging on the wall. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, washed over her. It was the exact spot, the precise place where the tall, dark shadow of the man had stood. The irritation vanished, replaced by a surge of adrenaline that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. Fear and curiosity waged a war in her gut. Her first instinct was to grab Leo, to pull him away, to forbid him from ever touching that spot again. The shadow had been a warning, a territorial marker, and this felt like a trespass. But another, more powerful impulse took hold. This was not a random noise. It was a clue. It was the first thing in this God-forsaken place that felt like more than just rot and ruin. It was a thread, and some desperate, forgotten part of her needed to pull on it. She crawled over to Leo, her movements slow and deliberate, as if approaching a sleeping animal. She could feel her heart pounding a frantic, unsteady rhythm against her ribs. The air in the room suddenly felt thick and heavy, charged with a silent, waiting energy. She stared at the floorboard, seeing not just wood, but a question demanding an answer. She pressed down on the board with the palm of her hand. It felt solid, unmoving at first, just like its neighbors, but she pressed harder, putting her weight onto it, and she felt it. A slight, almost imperceptible give, a sponginess that wasn't from rot. Beneath the board was a space. It was not nailed down. A shiver traced its way down her spine, a cold finger of fear and excitement. The shadow, the sound, the loose board, they were all connected. This was not an accident. This was intentional. She needed to get it open. She looked at her hands, her fingernails broken and dirty from cleaning. They were useless. She needed leverage. Her eyes scanned the room, the pathetic collection of their belongings piled in a corner, and then she remembered. The tire iron, the heavy steel tool she'd used to change a flat tire on the long, miserable drive here. It was still in the trunk of the car, a piece of solid, functional reality in this house of ghosts. The short walk to the car felt like a journey across a vast, exposed plain. The wind whipped her hair across her face, and the mournful groan of the windmill's broken arms seemed to mock her. Every instinct screamed at her to get in the car with Leo and drive away, to not look back, to abandon this place and whatever secrets it held. But where would they go? This ruin was all they had. The cold, heavy weight of the tire iron in her hand was strangely comforting. It was a tool. It was a weapon. It was potential. When she returned to the main room, Leo was sitting exactly where she had left him, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and boyish anticipation. "Be careful, Mom," he whispered. Elena knelt, the cold of the floor seeping through her jeans. She wedged the flattened tip of the iron into the thin crack between the boards, took a deep breath that did little to steady her racing heart, and pushed down. For a moment, nothing happened. The board resisted, held fast by the grime and dust of decades. Elena gritted her teeth, a thin sheen of sweat breaking out on her forehead. She put all of her weight, all of her frustration and desperation, into the lever. There was a sharp, cracking sound of splintering wood, a noise that seemed deafeningly loud in the oppressive silence. She froze, her ears straining, listening for any response from the house, for the sound of footsteps, for the return of the shadow. Nothing, only the wind. She pushed again, and this time, with a low groan of protest. The long board tilted upwards, breaking free from its resting place. It was heavy, made of thick, old-growth timber. As she lifted it away and set it carefully on the floor beside the opening, a gust of air rose from the black void below. It was cool and surprisingly dry, and it carried a scent unlike the rest of the house, the clean, mineral smell of stone and dry earth, and the faint, dew-papery scent of undisturbed time. Leo crawled closer, peering into the dark opening with wide, curious eyes. "Is it a secret passage?" he asked, his voice filled with awe, the grim reality of their situation momentarily forgotten in the thrill of discovery. Elena's fear was still a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now mingled with an intoxicating sense of purpose. She pulled out her phone, the screen's harsh light a poor substitute for a proper flashlight. She switched on the small LED and aimed its weak beam into the hole. The light cut a narrow, trembling path through the darkness. It was not a passage. It was a small, man-made cellar, barely a crawl space, no more than 4 feet deep and perhaps 6 feet square. The walls were lined with rough-hewn, tightly fitted stones, a testament to the care someone had taken to keep this space protected from the damp that had consumed the rest of the house. The floor was packed earth. It was completely empty, except for one corner. Tucked away, almost hidden by the shadows just beyond the reach of her phone's light, was a dark shape. It was rectangular, covered in some kind of wrapping. Her breath hitched in her throat. This was it. This was what the shadow, the board, the secret cellar had been leading her to. Her mind reeled with possibilities, each one more fantastic than the last. Money, valuables, or something more sinister. Evidence of a crime. Her imagination, starved for anything but despair, ran wild. The impulse to know, to see, to touch, was now an overwhelming physical need. The risks felt distant and unsubstantial compared to the pull of that dark shape in the corner. This little stone-lined pit felt like the absolute center of the world, the pivot point on which her and Leo's entire future was about to turn. She had to go down there. There was no other choice. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was an explorer, a detective on the verge of a profound discovery. "Stay here, Leo. Don't move," she commanded, her voice firm, betraying none of the terror that was making her limbs tremble. The opening was narrow, and she had to lower herself in feet first, her back scraping against the rough edge of the floorboards. The moment her feet touched the packed earth floor of the crawl space, a wave of claustrophobia washed over her. The ceiling was just inches above her head when she stood up, forcing her into a crouch. The air was thin and cool, and the darkness outside the small cone of her phone's light was absolute. She could hear her own breath, loud and ragged in the enclosed space, and the sound of Leo's anxious shuffling on the floorboards above. A primal fear of being trapped, of the earth closing in around her, made her want to scramble back out into the relative openness of the decaying house. But the object in the corner held her fast. She shuffled forward in a crouch, the beam of her phone shaking in her trembling hand. As she got closer, she could see the wrapping more clearly. It was a large sheet of thick, black oilcloth, the kind used to waterproof old sails or coats. It was dusty, but otherwise perfectly preserved by the dry conditions of the cellar. It was wrapped carefully around a solid object, tied with a length of brittle-looking rope. Her heart was a wild drum in her chest. She reached out a hesitant hand, her fingers brushing against the cool, slightly waxy surface of the oilcloth. It felt ancient. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled resolve, she grabbed the rope. It was so dry that it crumbled into dust and fibers in her grasp. The oilcloth fell open, revealing what lay beneath. It was a metal box, a heavy, black utilitarian lockbox about the size of a shoebox, its surface pitted with spots of rust, but fundamentally solid. The box was far heavier than it looked. As she worked her fingers underneath it, the dense, concentrated weight sent a jolt of surprise through her arm. This was not a box of old letters. This was a box of something substantial, something with mass and value. Grunting with the effort, she lifted it. The muscles in her back and arms screamed in protest. She maneuvered it beneath the opening in the floor, her body twisted in the cramped space. "Leo, I'm going to pass this up to you. Get ready." "It's heavy," she called out, her voice echoing strangely in the stone chamber. She saw his small hands appear in the opening. "I'm ready," he said, his voice a mixture of excitement and strain. With one final, desperate heave, she pushed the box upwards. Leo grasped it, his arms immediately buckling under the unexpected weight. "I've got it," he grunted, and with a great scraping sound, he managed to drag it out onto the floor. Clambering out of the crawl space, Elena felt a wave of relief as she stood up in the main room, her body covered in dust and cobwebs, her lungs filling with the familiar foul air of the house. For a moment, she and Leo just stared at the lockbox sitting on the floor between them. It was an alien object, a piece of a hidden secret world that had just collided with their own. It radiated a silent, powerful energy, a sense of immense importance. The simple, rusted lock on the front seemed like the final guardian of a forgotten story. A profound sense of unreality settled over Elena. Just hours ago, she had been drowning in a sea of hopeless despair, and now she was kneeling on a dusty floor, about to open a secret box that had been hidden for decades. Hope, an emotion she thought had died forever, flickered weakly in her chest, a tiny, fragile flame in the overwhelming darkness. "How do we open it?" Leo asked, his eyes glued to the lock. The question brought Elena back to the practical reality of the moment. The lock was simple, but it was sturdy, and she had no key. Frustration, sharp and bitter, flared within her. To have come this far, to be so close, only to be stopped by a small piece of rusted metal, felt like a uniquely cruel joke. She ran her fingers over the cold metal, feeling the pitting of the rust, searching for any weakness. Then, her eyes fell upon the tire iron, lying on the floor where she'd left it. Of course, the tool that had served as their key to the cellar would now be their key to the box. "Hold it steady, Leo," she instructed, her voice low and tense. She positioned the pointed end of the iron into the hasp of the lock, took a firm grip, and with a grunt of exertion, she twisted it with all her strength. There was a moment of groaning, metallic resistance, and then a sudden, violent crack. The sound was shocking in its finality, echoing through the derelict house like a gunshot. The lock, brittle with age, shattered, a piece of rusted metal flying across the room and clattering against the far wall. The box was open. A profound silence fell over the room, broken only by the sound of their own breathing. Elena felt a strange sense of trespass, as if she had just broken a sacred seal. There was no going back, whatever was inside this box. Their lives were now tied to it. She hesitated for a long second, her hand hovering over the lid. Then she took a deep breath, her fingers closing around the edge, and she lifted it. The hinges, stiff with disuse, let out a long, drawn-out screech, a sound like a pained sigh. The air that wafted out of the box was a potent, layered scent of history. It was dominated by the rich, musty smell of old leather and the dry, slightly sweet aroma of aging paper. But beneath that, there was another scent, a faint, almost imperceptible smell that was earthy and mineral-like, the smell of the deep earth itself. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering into the box's interior. The contents were packed tightly, a testament to the care of whoever had hidden it. On top lay a book, its cover made of dark, worn leather, its pages thick and yellowed with age. Beside it, tied with a loop of faded twine, were two thick accounting ledgers, their cardboard covers warped slightly, and nestled beneath them, in a hollowed-out space, was a small pouch made of dark velvet, its drawstring pulled tight. It was lumpy, and even from a glance, looked heavy. Elena's hands, which had been so steady when breaking the lock, were now trembling uncontrollably. She felt a magnetic pull towards the velvet pouch. The books, the diary, they promised a story, a history. But the pouch promised something more immediate, more tangible, survival. With fingers that felt clumsy and numb, she lifted it from the box. The weight was astonishing for its size, a solid, reassuring heft in her palm. The velvet was so old it felt almost like silk, worn smooth by time and touch. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, each beat a deafening thud in her ears. She fumbled with the drawstring, her fingers struggling to undo the simple knot. The string gave way, and she tipped the pouch over her other hand, her breath catching in her throat as the contents tumbled out. They were not the glittering, multifaceted jewels she had seen in store windows. They were dull, almost greasy-looking stones of varying sizes, with a milky, translucent quality. They looked like worthless pieces of quartz or glass. But as she shifted her hand, a stray beam of afternoon light from a broken window struck them, and they came alive. Deep within each stone, a fire ignited, refracting the light into 1,000 tiny rainbows. They were diamonds, raw, uncut, and unmistakable. Dozens of them, a king's ransom lying in the palm of her dirty, chapped hand. A wave of vertigo washed over Elena, so powerful she had to put a hand on the floor to steady herself. It was too much to process, the sheer, staggering value of it. This was not just money, it was freedom. It was a new life. It was safety for Leo. It was a future. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden, blurring the impossible sight in her hand. After a long moment, she carefully poured the diamonds back into the pouch, her hand still shaking, and cinched it tight. The immediate, desperate pressure of survival had momentarily lifted, only to be replaced by 1,000 new questions. Where had they come from? Who had hidden them here? And why? Her gaze fell back to the other contents of the box. She picked up the leather-bound book, a diary. The cover was cool and brittle to the touch. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was small and spidery, the ink faded from black to a rusty brown. A date was written at the top of the page, a date from over 40 years ago. Below it, the first entry began. The captain came again tonight. The devil always arrives after dark. A chill, entirely unrelated to the cold of the house, crept down Elena's spine. This was not a simple treasure. This was something dark. Her fingers trembling slightly, she set the diary aside and reached for the two ledgers. They were standard accounting books, filled with neat columns and precise entries, but this was no ordinary business record. She opened the first one. The pages were a cryptic sea of dates, names, and numbers followed by unfamiliar abbreviations: CT, G, CLR. One line stood out: Valerius, Captain, 582 Sict, Consignment, 4, Source, The Disappeared. The words sent a fresh jolt of fear through her. The Disappeared, the Captain. This was not a smuggler's logbook. This was a record of something monstrous. The diamonds in the pouch suddenly felt different in her lap. Their weight was no longer reassuring. It was terrifying. It was the weight of a dark and violent history. The box did not just contain a fortune, it contained proof. She had not stumbled upon a treasure. She had stumbled upon a crime. She quickly closed the ledger, a feeling of profound danger settling over her. The house, which had felt haunted by a ghost, now felt haunted by something far more real and threatening. The men who had filled these pages, the shadow she had seen in the mirror, suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. It was not a ghost of the past. It was a guardian of it, or perhaps a hunter. Was someone else looking for this box? The thought made her blood run cold. She looked around the dilapidated room, at the gaping windows and the door hanging from its hinges. Their isolation, which had been a source of despair, now felt like a deadly vulnerability. The joy and relief she had felt upon finding the diamonds curdled into a new, more potent kind of fear. This discovery was not the end of their problems. It was the beginning of a whole new and infinitely more dangerous one. The mystery of the house had been solved, only to be replaced by a far larger and more terrifying one. Who was the miller who wrote this diary? Who was the captain? And what happened to the disappeared? The questions swirled in Elena's mind, each one more menacing than the last. She looked down at the box, at the diary and the ledgers, at the velvet pouch heavy with its dark fortune. This was a secret that people had killed to keep, and she was now its keeper. A wave of nausea, the same she had felt when she first saw the foreclosure notice, rose in her throat. She had been searching for a roof over their heads, a simple refuge from poverty. Instead, she had unearthed a decades-old conspiracy, a story of theft and she suspected murder. The forgotten windmill was not just a ruin, it was a tomb, and she had just unlocked its secrets. The weight of this knowledge, this dangerous, bloody history, settled upon her, heavier than any debt. With Leo finally asleep on his makeshift bed, a small island of peace in an ocean of decay, Eleanor lit a single candle. Its small, flickering flame pushed back the oppressive darkness of the main room, casting long, dancing shadows that made the ruin feel alive and watchful. Her hands trembled as she picked up the leather diary. The material was cold and brittle, and it felt like she was holding a piece of a human soul. The smell of old paper and dried ink filled her nostrils, a scent of entombed secrets. She felt her heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm, a drumbeat of dread. She was about to cross a threshold, to read words not meant for her, to invite a dangerous past into her already shattered present. A cold sweat prickled her scalp. She took a ragged breath, the foul air of the house filling her lungs, and opened the book to the first marked page. The spidery script seemed to bleed into the yellowed paper, and the first sentence she read made the blood in her veins turn to ice. The captain came again tonight. The devil always arrives after dark. The words of the long-dead miller flowed from the page. Her ghostly confession whispered across 4 decades. He wrote not of grain and wind, but of fear. A suffocating, all-encompassing fear of the military dictatorship that held the country in its iron fist. He described a nation shrouded in silence, where neighbors disappeared in the night and whispers were a form of treason. He, the miller, a simple man named Thomas, had been chosen, not for his skills, but for his location. His windmill, isolated and forgotten, was the perfect vein for a secret economy of terror. The captain, a man whose name was only mentioned with a palpable sense of dread, had made him an offer he could not refuse. The alternative was to become one of the disappeared himself, leaving his own wife and child to starve. Elena felt a pang of cold, terrible empathy. She understood this kind of choice, the kind that wasn't a choice at all, where survival meant sacrificing a piece of your own soul. The diary was a testament to that slow, agonizing corrosion. The scheme was as simple as it was monstrous. The windmill was not used to grind wheat, but to launder blood money. The captain and his network of corrupt military officials were systematically plundering the assets of their victims, political prisoners, intellectuals, persecuted families, stripped of everything before they were taken away to prisons or unmarked graves. Their stolen wealth, often in the form of jewelry and raw diamonds, was funneled through the windmill. Thomas, the miller, was forced to act as the middleman, the keeper of secrets, the man who stored the treasure and documented its movement. Elena felt a wave of nausea so profound she had to close her eyes. She pictured the velvet pouch in her lap, the cold, hard weight of the diamonds. They were not just stones. They were the condensed tears and terror of countless families, the final remnants of stolen lives. The fortune she held was not a gift, it was a curse, a heavy, blood-soaked anchor to a history of unimaginable cruelty. But Thomas was not merely a victim. The diary revealed a man slowly being eaten alive by his own guilt. He wrote of his wife's confusion, of the nightmares that plagued his sleep, of the terror he felt every time he heard a car approaching in the dead of night. This guilt festered and grew into a seed of rebellion. He could not fight the captain, but he could steal from him. In a desperate act of penance, he began to skim a small portion of the diamonds from each shipment, a tiny act of defiance that put his life at immediate risk. He hid them, planning to one day return them to any surviving family members he could find. But his true weapon was not the stones, it was the ledgers. With meticulous, obsessive care, he secretly created a second set of accounting books, documenting every gram on every carat, every stolen heirloom, and most importantly, he documented the names, the name of the captain and the names of his accomplices. He was building a case. He was crafting a bomb. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. She picked up one of the thick ledgers, its pages stiff and cold. Her fingers, smudged with dust and grime, traced the neat columns. She found an entry in the diary dated from 40 years ago. The Cohen family. He a professor, she a musician. Their daughter's locket. He said it was worthless. I saw him pocket it. Her breath caught in her throat. She frantically flipped through the ledger, her phone's weak light dancing over the spidery script. And there it was, a corresponding entry on the same date. Source: Cohen, J and R. Value: 203 key. Raw. 1x gold locket. Personal. Destination: Valerius. Captain: Valerius. The name stood out on the page like a bloodstain. The captain had a name. It made him real. It made him solid. It made the threat tangible, a living thing that could reach across 4 decades and touch her. The shadow in the mirror was no longer a ghost. It was the lingering presence of Captain Valerius, a man who had built a dynasty on murder and theft. The next afternoon, the sound ripped through the suffocating silence. It was the growl of a powerful, expensive engine, a noise that didn't belong in this world of wind and decay. Elena froze, a piece of stale bread halfway to her mouth. Leo stopped his play, his head tilting like a nervous animal. A cloud of dust was rising on the gravel track, a plume of dirt signaling the arrival of the outside world. Elena's blood ran cold. The diary and ledgers were hidden back in the cellar, the floorboard replaced, but the knowledge of them was a screaming presence in her mind. She felt instantly, terribly exposed. The house, with its gaping windows and broken door, no longer felt like a failing shelter. It felt like a trap with no walls. Her heart began to pound, a frantic, painful rhythm. She could hear the crunch of tires on gravel growing louder, closer. It was a sound of purpose, of intent. It was the sound of a predator approaching. She grabbed Leo's arm, pulling him close, her body a fragile shield against a threat she couldn't yet see. A sleek, black sedan so clean it seemed to absorb the light, rolled to a stop 50 feet from the house. It was a vision of obscene wealth and power against the backdrop of the skeletal windmill. For a long moment, nothing happened. The engine idled with a low, predatory hum, the tinted windows revealing nothing of the occupant within. Eleanor's mouth went dry. Her mind raced, replaying the name from the ledger. Valerius. Was it him? Had he somehow sensed that his secret was unearthed? The driver's side door finally opened, and a man emerged. He was in his late 60s, tall and impeccably dressed in a crisp linen shirt and tailored trousers that seemed immune to the dust and grime of the place. His hair was a distinguished silver, perfectly coiffed. He moved with the slow, confident grace of a man who owned the very ground he walked on. As he drew closer, Eleanor could see his face. It was tanned and handsome, etched with the fine lines of age, and it was fixed with a warm, practiced smile that did not, for a second, reach his cold, assessing eyes. He stopped a polite distance away, raising a hand in a gesture of friendly greeting. "Hello there," he called, his voice smooth and cultured, utterly devoid of the local accent. "I do apologize for just showing up like this. My name is Valerius." Eleanor felt the world tilt. The name, spoken aloud in this place, struck her with the force of a physical blow. A wave of dizziness made her sway, and she tightened her grip on Leo's shoulder to stay upright. Her blood roared in her ears. It was him, or his heir, the son of the devil from the diary. Her mind screamed at her to run, to grab Leo and flee into the fields, but her feet were rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a fear so profound it was almost sublime. She had to force air into her lungs to speak, her own voice sounding thin and foreign to her ears. "Hello," she managed, the single word a monumental effort. She could feel his eyes scanning the ruin, her own disheveled appearance, and her son, his small, frightened face pressed against her side. "I own most of the surrounding land," he continued, his smile unwavering, a perfect mask of neighborly charm. "I've been consolidating the parcels in this area for years, for a new development project. I was surprised when I learned this old wreck had finally sold. I must have missed the listing." He gestured vaguely at the decaying miller's house, a subtle look of distaste flickering across his features before the smile snapped back into place. "Look, I'll be direct. This place is a teardown. It's no place for a woman and her boy." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I'm prepared to offer you double what you paid for it. Cash. It would be a quick, clean profit for you, and you could find a real home, somewhere safe." The offer was a test. Elena knew it instantly. It was a baited hook, designed to see if she was just a desperate fool, or if she knew the land's true value was not in the dirt, but in what was hidden beneath it. Her mind was a maelstrom of terror and calculation. He was the son, the name from the ledger. He was searching. He had been searching for years, buying up the land, hunting for his father's sins and the stolen fortune that came with them. And now he was standing in front of her, his polite words barely concealing the decades of desperate searching. Elena felt a cold, sharp clarity pierce through her fear. Her life and Leo's depended on the next words to come out of her mouth. She had to be the person he wanted to see, a poor, ignorant widow, overwhelmed and in over her head. She forced a tired, grateful smile, a perfect mirror of his own disingenuousness. That's incredibly generous of you, Mr. Valerius," she said, her voice trembling just enough to be convincing. "But we have nowhere else to go. This is all we have. I think we'll try to make a go of it here." It was the most dangerous gamble of her life, and she felt the truth of that in every cell of her body. For a moment, there was only silence. The wind moaned through the broken windmill, and the low hum of Valerius's car was a menacing undertone. She watched his face, her heart hammering against her ribs. The change was subtle, but absolute. It was as if a mask had not just slipped, but vaporized. The warm, practiced smile vanished, leaving his mouth a thin, hard line. His eyes, which had been merely cold, now held an active, reptilian menace. The warmth in his voice evaporated, replaced by a flat, dangerous tone. "A shame," he said, the two words dropping into the silence like stones into a deep well. He was no longer looking at her, but through her, his gaze sweeping over the derelict house with a look of possessive fury. The friendly neighbor was gone. In his place stood the captain's son, a man who had inherited not just a name, but a legacy of ruthless violence. Elena felt a primal terror grip her. She had failed the test. He took a slow step forward, his expensive shoes crunching on the dry, dead grass. His gaze was deliberate, predatory. He looked at the sagging roof, the gaping windows, the isolation of the place. "It's a beautiful area," he said, his voice a low, conversational purr that was far more terrifying than a shout. "But it's remote, terribly remote. No neighbors for miles. No one to hear you if you scream." He let the sentence hang in the air, a naked threat disguised as an observation. Elena felt the breath catch in her throat. The heat of the afternoon sun seemed to vanish, replaced by an icy chill that radiated from him, a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature. She pulled Leo tighter against her, her protective instinct warring with the overwhelming urge to shrink away. He knew she was alone. He was reminding her of it. He was drawing a circle of vulnerability around her and her child. His eyes then drifted to the skeletal arms of the windmill, and this old wood, he mused. Almost to himself, so dry. It's a tinderbox, a stray spark, a faulty wire, a lightning strike. It would all go up so fast. An accident. The word accident was delivered with a slight, deliberate emphasis that made Elena's stomach clench with nausea. He was painting a picture for her, a vivid, terrifying image of fire in the night, of being trapped in this wooden tomb. It wasn't a warning about a potential danger. It was a promise. It was a direct threat to burn them out, or burn them in it. She could almost smell the smoke, hear the crackle of flames, feel the searing heat, The fear was no longer an abstract emotion. It was a physical sensation, a knot of ice and fire in her gut. He was telling her, in no uncertain terms, that he was capable of anything to get what he wanted. He finally turned his cold gaze back to her, his eyes locking onto hers. He looked down at Leo, who was hiding his face in Elena's side, and a flicker of something that might have been contempt crossed his face. "A single mother," he said softly, the words dripping with a kind of predatory pity. "And her son, so very vulnerable out here, all alone." He didn't need to say anything more. The threat was complete, delivered with the chilling precision of a surgeon. He had assessed her weakness, her isolation, her love for her child, and he had turned all of it into a weapon to be used against her. He was giving her one last chance to reconsider his offer. Elena stood frozen, the man's words echoing in the vast, empty space around them. She was no longer just a widow struggling with poverty. She was a witness, a target, the sole obstacle standing between a powerful, ruthless man and the erasure of his family's criminal history. Without another word, Valerius turned his back on them and walked calmly to his car. The deliberate, unhurried pace was an insult, a demonstration of his absolute certainty and power. The car door closed with a solid, definitive thud. The engine revved, and with a spray of gravel, the black sedan pulled away, disappearing back down the track, leaving only a cloud of dust and a silence that was 1,000 times heavier and more menacing than before. Eleanor stood trembling, her arms wrapped around her son, watching until the dust settled. The encounter had lasted less than 10 minutes, but it had irrevocably altered her world. The fear she felt now was a living entity, a poison that had seeped into the very air she breathed. She possessed a fortune in diamonds and the evidence to bring down a monster, but she was trapped, marked for death. What would you do in her place? Would you take the diamonds and the secret and run for your life, hoping to disappear before he could find you? Or would you stay and fight, risking not only your own life but your child's, for a justice 40 years overdue? The black sedan was gone, but its presence lingered like a toxic miasma, poisoning the air. Elena stood paralyzed, Leo a silent, trembling weight against her leg. The silence that rushed back in was no longer empty. It was filled with the echo of his words. Accident, fire, all alone. Each word was a sharp, jagged stone thrown at the fragile shelter of her sanity. A violent shiver racked her body, a delayed reaction of pure, undiluted terror. Her heart felt like a block of ice in her chest, and her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. The oppressive heat of the afternoon sun felt gone, replaced by a profound internal coldness that emanated from the core of her being. Valerius hadn't just threatened her. He had dissected her vulnerabilities with surgical precision and laid them bare. He had shown her the exact shape of her own demise, and the image was now burned onto the inside of her eyelids. The windmill was no longer a ruin, it was a pyre, and he had just handed her the match, waiting to see if she would use it on herself. Her gaze darted around the dilapidated room, seeing it through his eyes for the first time. It was a death trap. The dry, brittle wood of the walls, the sagging roof timbers covered in decades of dust, the cardboard patches on the windows. It was all just fuel. She could almost smell the acrid scent of smoke, feel the searing heat on her skin. He wouldn't even have to be here. A flicked cigarette into the dry grass, a faulty wire arranged by one of his men. It would be untraceable, an unfortunate tragedy. The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea through her. So powerful she bent over, gagging. The fear was no longer a shapeless dread. It was specific, detailed, and utterly convincing. Every creak of the old structure was no longer a sign of age, but a countdown. Every gust of wind was not a sound of nature, but the whisper of an approaching fire. The isolation she had lamented was now a tactical advantage for her murderer. They were utterly, hopelessly exposed, miles from any help, marked for destruction by a man who saw them as nothing. The immediate, crushing weight of her responsibility for Leo slammed into her. This was her fault. Her desperation had led them here, into this monster's hunting ground. She looked at her son's face, pale and streaked with dirt, his wide eyes fixed on her, searching for a reassurance she could not possibly give. A sob, thick with guilt and terror, caught in her throat. She had to get him out. Not tomorrow, not in an hour. Now, The instinct was so powerful, so primal, it overrode the paralysis of her fear. But where could they go? The $700 was gone. Their pathetic savings had been exchanged for this tomb. They had a few dollars in change, a quarter tank of gas, and a box of blood-soaked diamonds that was as much a target as it was a treasure. Running blindly was just another form of suicide. They would be hunted. Valerius, with his wealth and influence, could find them anywhere. She needed more than just an escape. She needed a weapon, she needed an ally, a piece of leverage, a sanctuary that he couldn't easily reach. An idea, fragile and desperate, began to form in the chaos of her mind. The village. It was a ghost of a chance, a wild gamble, but it was the only one she had. The people there, they were old. They had long memories. Valerius had called this place a teardown, dismissing it, and by extension, its history. But history was exactly what she held in her hands. The diary, the ledgers, they were a story that belonged to this place. Perhaps someone in that sleepy, forgotten village remembered the miller. Perhaps someone knew the name Thomas and remembered the whispers of what had truly happened. If she could find just one person who knew the truth, one person who hated the Valerius name as much as she now feared it, she might have a chance. It was a sliver of hope so thin it was almost invisible, but she clung to it like a drowning woman clings to a splinter of wood. The alternative was to wait here for the fire, and that was a fate she would not accept. Her survival instinct, long dormant, was screaming now. The sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple. The approaching night felt like a physical entity, a predator stalking them. Elena moved with a frantic, silent energy. "We're going to play a game, Leo," she whispered, her voice tight and strained. "A camping game. We have to pack a special bag, very quickly." While Leo, confused but obedient, gathered his drawing pad and the small red car, Eleanor moved to the cellar. Her hands shook as she lifted the floorboard. The smell of dry earth rose to meet her, the scent of secrets. She grabbed the metal lockbox, its cold, heavy reality, a terrifying comfort in her hands. She wrapped it in a dirty blanket and placed it deep inside her largest bag, piling their few remaining clothes on top. She added the last of their water bottles and the stale bread. It was a pathetic collection of supplies for a fugitive. She felt a profound sense of unreality, as if she were watching a character in a movie. A poor, hunted woman packing a bag in a ruin, a monster closing in. The drive was a nightmare. She waited until the first hint of dawn, when the darkness was a soft, forgiving grey rather than an oppressive black. The old car's engine turning over sounded like a gunshot in the immense silence, and she flinched, expecting to see headlights appear behind them. Every mile of the gravel track felt like an eternity. Her eyes glued to the rearview mirror, her body rigid with tension. She imagined Valerius's black sedan appearing over the rise, its engine a low growl of doom. The fear was a coiling serpent in her stomach, making it impossible to breathe deeply. Leo had fallen into an uneasy sleep in the passenger seat, his head lolling against the window. His innocence was a constant, searing pain in her heart. She was a refugee in her own country, fleeing with her child and a dark secret, driving away from a pyre she had purchased with the last of their money. The world felt hostile and alien, a place where monsters wore handsome suits and preyed on the desperate. The first sight of the village was like seeing a lighthouse in a storm. It was just a handful of distant, weak yellow lights in the pre-dawn gloom, but it was proof that they were not entirely alone in the world. As they drew closer, the village revealed itself to be a place seemingly unstuck in time. The houses were small, made of stone and weathered wood, with sloping tin roofs and small, neat gardens. There were no sleek sedans here, only old dusty pickup trucks and bicycles leaning against fences. An ancient gnarled oak tree stood in a tiny square, its branches like the arms of an old man reaching for the sky. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth, a clean, honest smell that was the antithesis of Valerius's sterile power. But the quiet, sleeping village also felt impenetrable, its secrets locked away behind closed doors. She felt like an intruder, a carrier of a dangerous contagion, and she feared they would cast her out rather than help her. Her hope flickered, threatened by the deep, ingrained suspicion of a small, isolated community. She parked the car at the edge of the tiny town square, the engine sputtering into a silence that was immediately filled by the sound of birdsong. The normalcy of it was jarring. How could the world be so peaceful when her own was exploding? Leo was waking up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Are we there?" he mumbled. Elena had no answer. She didn't know what there was anymore. She saw an old woman in a headscarf sweeping her front porch, the rhythmic scrape of the broom a steady, calming sound. Taking a deep breath that did little to calm the frantic beating of her heart, Elena got out of the car. Her legs felt weak and unsteady. "Excuse me," she called, her voice raspy. The woman looked up, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes cautious. "I'm sorry to bother you. I'm looking for someone who knows the history of this area. The oldest resident, perhaps, or a town historian." The woman squinted at Eleanor's disheveled appearance, her gaze lingering on the old, dusty car. Then she pointed a gnarled finger down the street. "Alvaro," she said. "He was the postman. He knows everything." Alvaro's house was at the very end of the street, small and unassuming, with a riot of colorful flowers bursting from its window boxes. It looked like a place of peace, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside Elena. A small, hand-painted sign on the gate read, "Alvaro Reis, retired." The name felt ordinary, safe, but her hand trembled as she lifted it to knock on the weathered wooden door. The sound seemed thunderous in the morning quiet. She could hear her own heart, a frantic drum against her ribs. What if he refused to help? What if he was afraid? What if he was loyal to the Valerius family? The fear of rejection, of being turned away, was a cold knot in her stomach. She was placing her and Leo's lives in the hands of a complete stranger, based on the desperate hope that memory was stronger than fear. She heard the sound of slow, shuffling footsteps approaching from within, and then the click of a bolt being drawn. The door creaked open a few inches, revealing a sliver of a dimly lit interior. A man's face appeared in the gap. He was old, impossibly old, his skin like wrinkled parchment stretched over a delicate bone structure, but his eyes, under bushy white eyebrows, were startlingly clear and sharp, missing nothing. They took in her frayed clothes, the exhaustion etched onto her face, the small, frightened boy hiding behind her legs, and the raw desperation in her own gaze. He didn't speak, just looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Alvaro," Elena began, her voice barely a whisper. "My name is Elena. I was told you know the history of this place. I need your help. I'm in terrible trouble." The old man's gaze didn't waver. He seemed to be looking not at her but into her, weighing her words, her fear. After a silence that stretched for an eternity, he opened the door wider. "Come in," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. The boy, too. "Come in out of the sun." The simple invitation was so unexpected, so kind that tears instantly sprang to Elena's eyes. It was the first act of grace she had experienced in what felt like a lifetime. The inside of the house was a sanctuary of stories. Every surface was covered in books, towering, teetering stacks of them on the floor, crammed into overflowing shelves that lined every wall. The air smelled of aging paper, leather bindings, and the faint, sweet scent of old pipe tobacco. It was the smell of a life dedicated to the preservation of the past. It felt safe. Alvaro gestured to a pair of worn armchairs near a cold fireplace. "Sit," he commanded gently. He shuffled to a small kitchen area and returned with 2 glasses of water, his movements slow but deliberate. He handed one to Elena and one to Leo, who took it with a shy murmur of thanks. The cool water was a balm to Elena's parched throat, but it did little to quell the frantic energy inside her. She sat on the edge of the chair, her hands twisting in her lap, the weight of the lockbox in her bag a burning presence. She didn't know where to begin. How could she explain the shadow, the diamonds, the ledgers, the murderous threat, without sounding like a madwoman? She started hesitantly, her voice low and trembling. She spoke of her husband's death, of the foreclosure, of the desperation that led her to buy the old Windmill property. She described the ruin, the despair, the feeling of being watched. Alvaro listened without interruption, his sharp eyes fixed on her face, his hands resting on his knees. He nodded slowly, as if he had heard parts of this story before, but when she spoke of the loose floorboard, of the hidden cellar, his posture changed. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intensifying. He was no longer just a kind old man offering shelter. He was a historian who had just heard a keyword, a clue that unlocked a forgotten archive in his mind. The air in the room grew tense, charged with unspoken history. Elena could feel the shift, the quickening of his interest, and it gave her the courage to continue. She was not just telling her story, she was stumbling into his. She had found a piece of a puzzle he had been staring at for decades. The fear in her gut began to mix with a new, strange feeling, a sense of purpose. Her breath hitched. The next words were the most dangerous. To speak the name was to make it real, to give it power, to tie this kind old man to her fate. "In the cellar," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "We found a box. There were things inside. A diary." She paused, her eyes locking with his. It belonged to the miller, a man named Thomas. The moment she said the name, the air left the room. Alvaro's face, which had been full of keen interest, suddenly became a mask of profound, ancient grief. His sharp eyes clouded over, and the lines around his mouth deepened. He visibly flinched, as if she had struck him. It was a reaction of such deep, personal pain that Elena immediately fell silent. This wasn't just history to him. This was a wound, a raw, unhealed wound that she had just, unwittingly, torn open. He knew. He didn't just know the story. He had lived it. The realization sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with her own fear. She had found the one person on earth who understood, and the knowledge was both a relief and a terrifying burden. The old man slowly rose from his chair and walked to a window that looked out over the quiet village street. He stood with his back to her for a long time. His frail shoulders slumped. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with the weight of 40 years of unspoken grief. When he finally turned around, his face was grim, his eyes holding a dark, sorrowful light. "Thomas," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper, "he was my friend." The simple declaration landed with the force of a physical blow. My father was the postman before me. Thomas was, he was a good man, a quiet man. He loved his wife, his boy, but he was haunted. We all saw it. He carried a terror inside him that was eating him alive. Alvaro's gaze became distant, lost in a memory from a lifetime ago. He came to my father one night. Not long before he vanished. He was pale, shaking. He said he had proof of the captain's crimes, not just theft, murder. Eleanor's heart stopped. The vague horrors of the diary were solidifying into a concrete, personal tragedy right here in this room. Alvaro shuffled back to his chair and sank into it, the energy seeming to drain out of him. "He had ledgers," Alvaro continued, his voice barely audible. "He showed my father one of the pages. Names, dates, things he was forced to oversee at that cursed windmill. He said he had skimmed enough of the devil's currency to make sure the families got something back someday, but the ledgers were his real weapon. He was taking them to the federal authorities in the capital. He was going to expose the captain and his whole network." He paused, taking a shaky breath. My father begged him not to go. He told him it was suicide. The captain had eyes everywhere. But Thomas was consumed by his guilt. He said he couldn't live with the silence anymore. He said he had to do it, for his own soul. Elena felt a profound sorrow for the long-dead miller, a man she had only met through his spidery handwriting. She now understood the desperate courage it took to write those entries, to build that case, knowing it would almost certainly cost him his life. "He was supposed to leave on a Tuesday," Alvaro said, his voice flat and dead. "He never made it. On Monday night, his wife heard a car. She said Thomas went outside. He never came back." The next morning, the official story came down from the regional command. The miller, Thomas, had abandoned his family, run off with a stash of money. It was a lie. We all knew it was a lie. He slammed a frail, trembling fist onto the arm of his chair, a sudden burst of ancient anger. His wife lost her mind with grief. She died a year later. Their son was sent away to live with distant relatives. The family was erased. The story was buried, and we were all too scared to say a word. We just whispered. We whispered about the captain, who had been seen in the area that week. We whispered about the new money that suddenly flooded his family. He looked Elena directly in the eyes, his own shining with unshed tears. We were cowards. We let them get away with it. A cold, horrifying certainty dawned on Elena, connecting the final dots. Valerius, she breathed, the name tasting like poison. The captain's name was Valerius. Alvaro nodded slowly. his expression grim. The father, the monster who built his fortune on the graves of the disappeared, and the man who visited you, the one buying up all the land, the one who calls himself a respectable developer, that is his son. He is not just looking for the land, my child. He is not even just looking for the diamonds. He is hunting for his father's sins. He is hunting for those ledgers, for the proof, that box you found. It is the one thing in this world that can destroy him, and the tainted legacy he protects. Eleanor felt the floor drop out from under her. The true scale of her discovery, its immense, terrible power, was finally clear. This was not a treasure map. It was a death warrant, and she was the one who held it. She felt the weight of Tomas's courage, of Alvaro's grief, of all the stolen lives settling onto her shoulders. "He will not stop," Alvaro said, his voice regaining a measure of its strength, a hard edge of warning. "He is more dangerous than his father, because he is a man defending a lie. He has a reputation, a public face to protect. He will kill you and your boy and sleep soundly that night, convinced he is protecting his family's honor. You cannot stay at that windmill. You cannot stay in this village. You cannot stay anywhere he might think to look." The old man's words were not meant to frighten her, but to arm her with the brutal truth. The threat was no longer a vague promise of an accident. It was an imminent, personal vendetta. Valerius would not send a warning next time. He would send his men to finish it, to retrieve the box, and erase the only two people on earth who knew it existed. The small, book-filled room no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like the last calm moment before the hurricane made landfall. A wave of adrenaline, cold and sharp, washed through Elena's veins. The time for fear was over. It was time to act. Alvaro got up and shuffled over to an old wooden desk cluttered with papers. He rummaged through a drawer and pulled out a small, worn address book. He carefully wrote a name and a number on a scrap of paper. "This is a lawyer in the capital," he said, pressing the paper into her hand. "A good man, a brave man. He specializes in human rights cases, cold cases from the dictatorship. He will know what to do with this. He will understand the importance of the ledgers. You must call him. But you must be somewhere safe first. Get the box, get your boy, and drive. Don't stop until you are in the city. Do you understand me, Elena?" She looked at the name on the paper. The ink a fragile shield against a world of violence. A plan. She finally had a plan. A direction. It was terrifying, but it was real. "The box," she said, her own voice sounding surprisingly steady. "It's still at the house. I have to go back for it. I can't leave it there." Alvaro's face clouded with alarm. "It's too dangerous," he insisted. "He could be watching the place." "I have to," Elena repeated, a new, hard resolve solidifying within her. "It's the only weapon I have. It's the only thing that will keep us safe in the long run. Leaving it behind is leaving us defenseless." It was the most reckless thing she had ever done, but it also felt like the only choice. To flee without the proof was to be a perpetual victim, always looking over her shoulder. To secure the proof was to become a fighter. She saw a flicker of understanding, of respect in Alvaro's old eyes. He recognized the same desperate courage he had once seen in his friend Thomas. He gave a single, reluctant nod. "Be quick," he whispered. "Be a ghost. Get the box and do not look back." The journey back to the windmill was a blur of adrenaline and terror. The sun was higher now, beating down on the empty landscape. Every bird that took flight, every rustle in the dry grass, sounded like an approaching threat. She felt exposed, a single moving target in a vast, empty shooting gallery. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel, her gaze constantly flicking to the rearview mirror. As she pulled the car up to the windmill, the place felt different. The silence was heavier, more menacing. The skeletal structure seemed to mock her, a monument to her folly. She left Leo in the car, the doors locked. "Don't open for anyone," she commanded, her voice sharp with an urgency that made him flinch. "I'll be right back." She ran into the house, her heart pounding against her ribs. The main room was just as she'd left it, shrouded in grime and gloom. She tore the floorboard open, the sound of the wood scraping against the floor deafeningly loud. She reached into the crawl space, her hands closing around the heavy metal box. It felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, the physical manifestation of all the death and fear it contained. She had it. She was backing out of the cellar, her muscles screaming with the effort, when her phone, which she had left on a dusty table, began to ring. The sound was a violent intrusion, an alarm bell that made her entire body jolt with shock. It was Alvaro. His name flashed on the screen. She fumbled to answer it. The heavy box clutched to her chest. "Elena!" His voice was a panicked, breathless rasp. "He's coming. I saw the car, the black sedan. It went past my house, heading your way. Fast. But there was another car with it. They are coming for you. Get out. Get out now." At the exact same moment his words hit her. She heard it. The sound of cars, more than one, driving too fast on the gravel track. The crunch of tires stopping abruptly outside. A car door slammed, then another. They were here. There was no time. The front door. It was their only way out. She started towards it, dragging the box, her mind screaming. But before she could take 2 steps, a heavy boot slammed into the door, the rotting wood splintering with a sound like a gunshot. Another kick, and the door flew open, torn from its single remaining hinge, crashing to the floor with a deafening boom. 2 men stood silhouetted in the doorway, large and brutal shapes against the bright afternoon light. They were not here to talk. Panic, pure and primal, erased all thought. The men started to advance into the room, their faces hard and expressionless. Elena's eyes darted around, searching for an escape. There was none. The front was blocked. The windows were too high, too small. Then she saw it. In the back of the room, a large window that looked out onto the overgrown fields behind the windmill. It was her only chance. The tire iron. It was still lying on the floor where she had used it on the lock. Without a second of hesitation, she dropped the lockbox, lunged for the iron, and spun around. One of the men was almost upon her. He reached for her. She swung the heavy steel tool in a wide, desperate arc, not at him, but at the window. The sound of shattering glass was an explosion of hope. It echoed the sound of her own breaking point. She was no longer a victim. She was a force of nature, a mother protecting her child, fueled by terror and rage. The opening was a jagged mouth leading to freedom. She scrambled back, grabbed the lockbox with one hand and Leo's backpack with the other. Just as the men recovered from their surprise and lunged for her, she hurled herself through the broken window. Shards of glass sliced at her arms and legs, the pain sharp and immediate, but she barely felt it. She landed hard in a tangle of weeds and thorns outside, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. She could hear the men shouting from inside the house. She didn't look back. She scrambled to her feet, her body screaming in protest, the heavy box banging against her leg. She ran. She ran with a strength she didn't know she possessed, fueled by pure adrenaline. She crashed through the overgrown fields, thorns tearing at her clothes, her feet stumbling on the uneven ground. She could hear them behind her, the sound of them crashing through the undergrowth, their curses carrying on the wind. But she had a head start. She ran towards the distant, hazy shimmer of the village, the lights of Alvaro's house, a tiny, distant promise of sanctuary. She ran, clutching the evidence, her son's life in her hands, leaving the haunted windmill and its ghosts behind her. The sounds of pursuit began to fade, replaced by the sound of her own ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of her heart. The sun beat down on her, the heat oppressive, but she didn't slow. The village lights seemed to get no closer, a cruel optical illusion in the vast, empty landscape. Every muscle in her body burned. Her lungs felt ready to burst, and the cuts on her arms and legs were now stinging, streaks of blood welling up through the grime. But the weight of the box in her hand was a constant, driving reminder of why she was running. It was the miller's legacy. It was justice for the disappeared. It was her and Leo's only chance at a future. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a fierce, burning resolve. She had been hunted, threatened, and attacked, but she was still moving forward. She was no longer just Elena, the grieving widow. She was the keeper of a secret, the carrier of a truth so powerful that men would kill for it. And she would not let them have it. The race for her life had just begun. Elena crashed through Alvaro's door like a ghost escaping a tomb, her breath coming in ragged, tearing sobs. She was a ruin of a woman, her clothes shredded, her arms and legs bleeding from a dozen shallow cuts where the glass and thorns had kissed her skin. The heavy metal lockbox thudded onto the floor, a dark anchor in the quiet, book-filled room. Alvaro's face, a mask of terror moments before on the phone, hardened into grim resolve. His age seemed to fall away, replaced by the fierce urgency of a man who had waited 40 years for this exact moment. He didn't fuss over her wounds. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip surprisingly firm, and looked into her wild eyes. "You have it," he stated, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "You have his soul in that box." Without another word, he shuffled to his desk, his movements suddenly precise. His trembling fingers found the scrap of paper, and he dialed the number, the clicks of the old rotary phone sounding like a countdown to war in the silent house. The voice that answered was sharp, professional, and radiated the impatient energy of the capital city. "Almeida," it snapped. Alvaro didn't waste a second. "Mr. Almeida, my name is Alvaro Rice. I am calling on behalf of the late Tomas Ferraz. Miller, I have the evidence. The ledgers." There was a pause on the other end, a sudden, charged silence that felt more attentive than any word. Elena could hear the faint sound of a chair creaking as the lawyer, Almeida, leaned closer to his phone. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice stripped of its earlier impatience, now low and dangerously focused. "The Valerius ledgers," Alvaro clarified, his own voice gaining strength. "And a witness. She's here with me. They just tried to kill her." The transformation in Almeida's voice was absolute. "Don't move," he commanded, his tone now a blade of ice and authority. "Don't speak to anyone. I am mobilizing a federal team. We are coming to you. Tell me, Alvaro, are you secure?" The word "we" was a shield, the first real promise of protection they'd had. The end of the call plunged the room back into a surreal quiet. The sun was rising, casting long, gentle fingers of light across the dusty floor, illuminating the specks of blood Elena had left behind. The immediate threat had passed, replaced by the thrumming, high-strung energy of anticipation. Alvaro, moving with the slow, deliberate motions of a man performing a sacred ritual, began to make coffee. The rich, earthy smell of the grounds, the hiss of the water, were simple, grounding sensations that fought back against the terror. He brought Elena a cup, his old, wrinkled hand steady as he passed it to her trembling ones. The warmth of the ceramic seeped into her cold skin, a small, profound comfort. He then gently dabbed at the cuts on her arms with a clean cloth and stinging antiseptic, the sharp pain a welcome anchor to the present moment. Leo, awake now on a small sofa, watched with wide, silent eyes, understanding only that the frantic running had stopped and that this old man with kind eyes was helping his mother. They arrived just before dawn, not with screaming sirens, but as silent, dark shapes detaching themselves from the twilight. Two black, unmarked sedans, identical to Valerius's but radiating an entirely different kind of power. This was not the arrogant power of wealth. It was the quiet, implacable power of the state. Men in dark, functional clothing emerged, moving with a calm, professional efficiency that was both terrifying and deeply reassuring. One of them, a man in a sharp suit with tired but intelligent eyes, approached the door. "Alvaro Rice?" he asked, his voice low. It was Almeida, the lawyer from the phone. He looked at Elena, taking in her disheveled state with a flicker of empathy before his gaze settled on the lockbox still sitting on the floor. "That's it?" he asked. Eleanor could only nod. He knelt, his gloved hands treating the rusted metal box not as treasure, but as a sacred artifact. As he lifted it, Elena felt a weight she didn't know she was carrying, the weight of 40 years of secrets, finally lift from her shoulders. The raid was a symphony of silent, overwhelming force. As the sun's first rays touched the manicured lawns of the Valerius estate miles away, the federal team breached the perimeter. There was no shouting, no prolonged standoff. Valerius was apprehended in his study, a glass of expensive brandy in his hand, the very picture of insulated arrogance. The sight of armed federal agents flooding his personal sanctuary shattered his composure completely. The mask of the respected developer, the philanthropist, the pillar of the community, did not just crack, it disintegrated. His face, when the cold, unforgiving steel of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, was a canvas of pure, uncomprehending shock. It was the face of a man who had believed his father's money and influence had made him untouchable, a god in his own small kingdom, now reduced to a common criminal in a silk robe. The two thugs who had attacked Elena were pulled from the estate's guest house. their brutish confidence evaporating into sniveling fear in the face of true authority. The story exploded. The Valerius name, once synonymous with development and high society, was now irrevocably linked to the darkest chapter of the nation's history. The ledgers were a Rosetta Stone of corruption, their cryptic entries providing the missing links for dozens of cold cases, giving names back to the disappeared and revealing a network of terror and theft that reached the highest echelons of the old regime. The Windmill, once a forgotten ruin, was now a site of pilgrimage, swarmed by news vans and historians, and at the center of it all was Alvaro, the quiet, retired postman whose faithful guardianship of a friend's memory had become the key that unlocked it all. He gave his testimony with a simple, solemn dignity that captivated the nation. Eleanor, meanwhile, was kept in a secure, anonymous apartment in the capital, her identity fiercely protected by the prosecutor's office. The world outside was in an uproar, but for the first time in years, her small world was profoundly, blessedly quiet and safe. The legal process was swift and decisive. The diamonds, as Almeida had explained, were the proceeds of heinous crimes and were immediately seized as state's evidence. For a fleeting moment, Elena felt a pang of disappointment, the loss of that impossible, immediate wealth. But what came next was beyond anything she could have imagined. The special prosecutor's office formally declared that the evidence she had secured and protected at risk to her own life was of incalculable value to the nation. Under a federal asset recovery and witness protection statute designed for precisely such cases, she was granted a reward. One morning, Almeida sat with her and showed her a bank statement on a tablet. The number was so large it seemed unreal, a string of zeros that her mind struggled to process. It was not a fortune born of blood, but a reward earned through courage. Elena stared at the screen, tears silently streaming down her face, as the weight of every medical bill, every foreclosure notice, every hungry night simply dissolved into nothing. She never went back. The thought of the windmill, of the oppressive silence and the watchful shadows, still made her skin crawl. Her lawyer, Almeida, handled the disposition of the property. It was an infamous piece of land now, a place of dark legend, but instead of letting it be torn down or sold to a macabre tourist trap, they worked with a consortium of human rights groups. The Valerius estate was seized, and a portion of his liquidated assets were used to purchase the windmill property and establish a historical preservation society. The land was not to be a monument to a killer, but to his victims. The plan was to restore the miller's house and create a small, quiet museum and memorial dedicated to the families whose lives had been stolen by the regime. The centerpiece of the memorial would be a simple plaque bearing the name of its first, unheralded hero, Thomas Ferraz, the miller who refused to be silent. His act of courage, hidden for 40 years, was finally given the honor it was due. The sound that now filled Elena's home was not the mournful groan of wind through broken timbers, but the cheerful, rhythmic hum of a new Bernina sewing machine. Its needle danced effortlessly over a bolt of sapphire blue silk, the fabric cool and smooth under her fingers. Her new house was a small, sun-drenched bungalow on a quiet, tree-lined street in a city far from the dust and ghosts of her past. The air didn't smell of rot and decay, but of fresh-cut flowers from her small garden and the rich aroma of a roast chicken turning golden in the oven. Leo was no longer a silent, fearful shadow pressed against her side. He was in the backyard, his laughter carrying through the open window as he and two new friends kicked a soccer ball across a patch of bright green grass. Elena paused her work. Her hands, once raw and chapped, now simply the skilled hands of a creator. She felt the old ache of grief for her husband, but it was a gentle, quiet presence now, and she smiled, knowing with a profound certainty that she had kept her promise. Her life had found a new, peaceful rhythm. The boutique she opened downtown, Elena's Silks, was a modest success, a place of beauty she had built with her own two hands. It was a life she had never dared to dream of, forged in the crucible of despair and terror. Sometimes, looking out her clean kitchen window at the peaceful world outside, she would touch the faint, silvery scars on her arms, the only physical reminder of her flight through the broken glass. They were not marks of victimhood, but emblems of her survival, of a mother's fierce and desperate love. Elena's story is a testament to the courage that can be found in the deepest despair. But it also leaves us with a chilling question. How many other truths lie buried just beneath the surface of our world, waiting for one brave person to pry up the floorboards? If you were captivated by this story of hidden history and hard-won justice, make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss another tale of mystery and incredible redemption.